They refused a veteran entry to the submarine. Then the Admiral saw his name tag and froze. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to today's story. The air around the submarine port was thick with tension. The large vessel loomed in the background, its metallic surface gleaming under the harsh midday sun. A group of officers and enlisted personnel moved about the area, performing their final preparations for an upcoming mission. Among them stood an elderly man, his posture still upright despite his age. His hands, though slightly weathered, rested firmly on the cane in front of him. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the crowd, not with suspicion, but with a sense of quiet purpose. The young gate guard, who was tasked with controlling the entry, noticed the old man's approach. The guard was a fresh recruit, barely 20 years old, and with an air of arrogance, he stepped forward, arms crossed. "Hey, you can't just wander in here," the young man said, his tone dismissive. "This area is restricted to authorized personnel only. You need to leave." The veteran said nothing at first. His face was calm, but his eyes held a depth that the young guard couldn't fathom. The recruit's gaze softened as he gave the man a quick once-over. The old man was wearing an unassuming dark coat and simple shoes, a far cry from the uniformed sailors around him. The recruit sighed impatiently, stepping closer. "Look, old man, if you don't have the proper clearance, you need to leave. We're not here for your sentimental stroll down memory lane," the guard added, his voice laced with ridicule. He was still young, still carrying the arrogance of someone who had yet to understand the true weight of honor. The veteran's expression remained unchanged as he met the recruit's eyes. "I'm here for my old friend, General Wallace," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the guard paused, unsure of how to react. The mention of a general's name was not something to take lightly, but the recruit quickly dismissed it. "Yeah, right. A general, huh? You can't just come in here claiming to know people like that. I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the guard insisted, his patience wearing thin. A smirk formed on the young man's lips as he turned his gaze to the veteran's lapel. "What's that? Some kind of fake metal?" The recruit reached forward and grabbed the small, tarnished pin on the veteran's coat. The veteran's hand shot out quickly, but the guard pulled the pin away, shaking it in front of him. "Is this your big claim to fame?" the guard mocked, his laughter cutting through the still air. At that moment, something shifted in the veteran's demeanor. His expression softened for a brief second, and then the world around him seemed to blur. The bustling submarine port faded, replaced by the vivid, haunting images of the past. The stench of burning fuel, the sound of distant gunfire, and the heat of a jungle battle all rushed back into his senses. He was no longer an old man standing outside the submarine. He was a young officer in the thick of a brutal war. He could see the faces of his comrades, the camaraderie shared during moments of unimaginable hardship. And he could hear the voice of General Wallace, a voice full of gratitude, saying, "Keep this, John. It's not official, but it's the only thing I can give you. You saved us." The memory was sharp, vivid, and as painful as it was beautiful. The veteran's hand, still outstretched, trembled slightly. The vision vanished just as quickly as it had come, and he was back outside the submarine. The world had returned to its present form, but something in him had changed. The young recruit, still holding the pin, had no idea what had just transpired. But the veteran's gaze had hardened. "Don't touch that," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. The guard, oblivious to the weight of the moment, scoffed and took a step closer, his arrogance unabated. "Yeah, whatever. It's just some old junk. You're not going anywhere." That was when the air shifted again. From the corner of the veteran's eye, he noticed movement. An official convoy, sleek black vehicles cutting through the parking lot, tires screeching as they came to an abrupt stop. The young guard barely had time to react before the doors of the vehicles flung open. Out stepped several military officers, their uniforms immaculate, their presence commanding attention. The first man to step forward was a four-star admiral, his gaze piercing and full of authority. He did not look at the guard or the small crowd of onlookers. His eyes locked onto the old veteran, and without a word, he raised his hand to his brow in a sharp, precise salute. The recruit froze, his body stiffening as if paralyzed by the sudden shift in power. The veteran, now standing taller than before, acknowledged the salute with a slight nod. The Admiral did not lower his salute, but instead turned to address the stunned crowd. "This is John Miller." The Admiral's voice boomed, clear and strong. "He is the shepherd. He saved more lives than any of you will ever know. You do not question his presence here. He is owed a debt of honor that none of you can fathom." The crowd, including the young recruit, stood in stunned silence, their arrogance and mockery crumbling in the face of true respect. The veteran had never needed to prove his worth, but today, in this moment, the world had been reminded of the true meaning of honor. The Admiral's salute lingered in the air, and the young recruit stood frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The veteran, John Miller, had been dismissed and mocked only moments ago, but now, the world had shifted. The Admiral's voice had commanded attention, and with it, everything changed. The crowd of onlookers, including sailors and officers, who had once scoffed at the old man's presence, now stood in awe. Miller, a man whose presence could only be described as legendary, had earned the respect that had eluded him just moments before. The Admiral lowered his hand and turned his gaze back to Miller, his voice unwavering and filled with authority. "Follow me, Mr. Miller," he said. Without hesitation, Miller nodded and followed the Admiral into the submarine, the very vessel he had been barred from only minutes earlier. The group of officers and sailors, still stunned by the sudden turn of events, parted to make way for the two men. As Miller entered the submarine, he could feel the weight of his past pressing against him. The cool metal of the submarine's interior felt different now. It was not the cold, sterile environment of a machine. It was a place that held memories, stories of battles fought and lives saved. The hum of the engines and the smell of oil and steel triggered memories of a time long past, memories that were both painful and proud. The Admiral led Miller to the command center, where several high-ranking officers stood waiting. Their faces were a mixture of respect and curiosity, as if they were all trying to reconcile the man standing before them with the legend they had heard of. The Admiral motioned for Miller to take a seat, and without a word, the room fell silent. The tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. For a long moment, no one spoke. Miller, sitting across from the Admiral, simply stared ahead, his expression unreadable. He had spent a lifetime being underestimated, being ignored by those who didn't understand the weight of his past. But today was different. Today, the world had been forced to acknowledge who he was. The Admiral finally broke the silence. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, "I know you've heard the stories. The men you saved, the battles you fought, the lives you gave everything to protect." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly, his hand resting on the arm of the chair. He had heard the Admiral's words before, and yet, they always had the same effect on him. "It's not about the stories, Admiral," Miller replied quietly. "It's about the men who are still out there. The ones we couldn't save. The ones who didn't make it home." The Admiral nodded, his gaze softening for the first time. "I understand," he said. "But sometimes, it's not just about saving lives. It's about what we leave behind. It's about the legacy we create." Miller looked down at the small, tarnished pin on his lapel, the one that had caused so much mockery earlier. The pin, a simple piece of metal, held no official rank. But to him, it was everything. It was the reminder of the men he had carried home, the ones who had never made it back. "This," Miller said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This pin represents something greater than any medal or rank." The Admiral understood. He had seen it in Miller's eyes the moment he had stepped onto the submarine. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about fame or glory. It was about something deeper, something that only those who had truly lived through the horrors of war could understand. The Admiral stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "You're not just a veteran, Mr. Miller," he said. "You're a hero, and it's time the world knew that." As Miller stood to leave, the officers in the room stood in unison, saluting him. The respect was palpable, and for the first time in a long while, Miller felt a sense of peace. The man who had been mocked and dismissed was now standing in the heart of the submarine, the very place that had been closed to him just moments before. His legacy had been sealed, not by the medals on his chest, but by the respect he had earned through the lives he had saved and the battles he had fought. As he walked out of the submarine, the crowd that had once doubted him now watched in silence. They had witnessed something that few ever would, the quiet dignity of a man who had given everything for his country, and in return, had finally earned the respect he deserved. The air inside the submarine felt dense as the officers and crew, still adjusting to the sudden change in atmosphere, exchanged glances. The respect that had poured in with the Admiral's arrival had settled into an uneasy silence. John Miller sat quietly, observing the younger men around him. They were the future of the military, the ones who would take up the mantle of leadership, but Miller could tell that many of them didn't fully grasp the weight of the past. The Admiral had ordered the crew to return to their duties, but there was an unspoken understanding in the air. Today had not been just another routine visit to the submarine. It had been a moment of reckoning. "Mr. Miller," the Admiral finally spoke, breaking the silence, his voice still carrying the gravity of command. "You've earned the respect of this crew today, but there's something more I need to discuss with you." Miller looked up at him, his expression calm but attentive. The Admiral stood, walking over to a small desk cluttered with maps and mission reports. He picked up a file and handed it to Miller. "This is about your service record. I know it's not something you like to talk about, but it's time everyone knows the truth about you. The truth that only a few have ever known." Miller took the file, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was thick, filled with official documents, but it wasn't the weight of bureaucracy that mattered. It was the weight of the history contained within those pages. The Admiral continued, his voice softening slightly. "I've been in this game a long time, John. I've seen men come and go, but there are few who've left the mark you have. The world doesn't know about your actions in the field, the lives you saved, the impossible missions you completed. But that ends now. The public deserves to know who you are." Miller's gaze fell to the file in his hands. The stories inside it were not the kind of stories he liked to relive. He wasn't the type of man who sought recognition, but there was something about the way the Admiral spoke that made him reconsider. He thought of the men he'd lost, the battles he'd fought, and the countless hours spent in darkness, waiting for a chance to make things right. "I don't need any glory," Miller replied quietly, his voice steady but filled with the quiet wisdom that came from decades of service. "I did what I had to do. It's enough that the men I saved remember." The Admiral nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. "I know you don't want recognition, but sometimes it's not about what you want. It's about what the world needs to see. The younger generations need to understand what it means to serve, to sacrifice, to give everything for a cause greater than themselves. They need heroes like you to show them the way." Miller's eyes met the Admiral's, and for a moment, there was no need for words. The Admiral knew that Miller had never asked for accolades, and that his quiet humility was part of what made him so extraordinary. But the Admiral also knew that in a world where the sacrifices of veterans were too often forgotten, the truth needed to be told. "You don't have to do this for yourself, John," the Admiral said, his tone softer now. "You're doing it for all the men and women who never made it home, for the ones who don't have a voice anymore." Miller didn't speak for a long while, the weight of the Admiral's words settling in his chest. He thought about the men who had served alongside him, the ones who had been left behind, and the promise he'd made to them long ago, to never let their stories be forgotten. Finally, he looked up and nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's do it. For them." The Admiral smiled, his expression filled with respect. "We'll get this story out there, John. The world will know who you are, and more importantly, they'll know what it means to be a hero. A true hero." As Miller left the submarine that day, the world outside had changed. The crowd, which had once viewed him with skepticism and disdain, now looked at him with newfound respect. The Admiral's presence had been the catalyst, but it was Miller's actions, his service, and his unspoken commitment to the men he had saved that had finally earned him the honor he deserved. The veterans of past wars, the ones who had fought and died in obscurity, were no longer just nameless faces. They were heroes, legends whose stories would be told, remembered, and honored. And John Miller, once an overlooked old man, was now the embodiment of everything that was worth fighting for. The days that followed Miller's visit to the submarine were a whirlwind of media attention and public recognition. The Admiral had kept his word. Miller's story was no longer confined to the shadows of military history. It was now being broadcast across the country, shared on news outlets, veteran organizations, and even social media. His name was no longer just a whisper among the few who knew. Now, it was known far and wide, the legacy of a hero whose name had been forgotten for too long. As the public's recognition grew, so did the respect Miller had earned from his peers. The young sailors, the ones who had once mocked him and dismissed his presence, now looked at him differently. They saw him not just as an old man, but as a living legend. Officers who had once disregarded him began to approach him with a newfound respect, their voices filled with admiration rather than skepticism. But Miller, true to his nature, remained humble. He did not seek out the attention or accolades. He was content to let the recognition fall where it may, but his heart was not lifted by the applause. It was the quiet moments, the ones spent with the men he had served alongside, that brought him the most peace. One afternoon, Miller found himself sitting with a small group of veterans in a local diner, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. The conversation was casual, but the respect was palpable. These were men who had been through the fires of war, who understood the weight of what Miller had done. They spoke in low tones, sharing stories of their service, their sacrifices, and the comrades they had lost along the way. For a moment, Miller allowed himself to listen, to share in the camaraderie that had always been the bedrock of his life. It was during one of these conversations that an unexpected visitor arrived. The door to the diner opened, and in walked a tall, imposing figure. It was the Admiral, the same man who had helped elevate Miller's story to the public eye. His presence filled the room, and all conversation ceased as the Admiral made his way toward Miller's table. The men who had been speaking stopped, their eyes widening as the Admiral approached, but Miller remained seated, his expression unchanged. The Admiral walked directly to him, and without a word, he extended his hand. "John," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of respect. "It's good to see you." Miller took the Admiral's hand, shaking it firmly. "It's been a while," he replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The Admiral took a seat beside him, his demeanor still one of authority, but now tempered with the kind of warmth that came from mutual respect. "I wanted to thank you," the Admiral said, his gaze meeting Miller's. "For everything. For what you did for this country, and for the men who never came home." Miller nodded, his expression softening slightly. "We did what we had to do," he said quietly. "It's not about thanks. It's about the men we lost along the way." The Admiral looked down at the table for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I think it's time for the world to know. Your story is one that needs to be heard. The younger generation needs to understand what it really means to serve." Miller sighed, looking out the window at the passing cars. The weight of the Admiral's words settled on him once again. "I didn't do this for recognition," he said slowly. "But maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to tell the story. Not for me, but for them. The ones who never made it back." The Admiral smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You're not just a hero, John. You're a reminder of what this country stands for, what real sacrifice looks like." The conversation shifted then, as the Admiral and Miller talked about old missions, old friends, and the people they had served alongside. For a moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, and they were just two men sharing a quiet moment in the company of those who understood. As the meal came to a close, the Admiral stood and extended his hand once more. "Thank you, John," he said simply. Miller shook his hand again, nodding. "Take care, Admiral." As the Admiral walked out of the diner, Miller sat back in his chair, the weight of the years still present but not as heavy. He had done his part. He had kept the promises he made to his brothers in arms. And now, as his story was being shared, he knew that the legacy of the men he had served with, the men he had saved, would live on. The world was beginning to understand. And that, to Miller, was enough. The following weeks saw Miller's life becoming a strange mix of quiet solitude and sudden bursts of attention. It was as if the entire country had suddenly woken up to the truth of his legacy, the reality of his life and service. The phone calls came in waves, from old friends, from strangers, from people who had heard his name mentioned and wanted to learn more. He did not seek this attention, But the Admiral's words had echoed in his mind. It was not about him anymore, not about the recognition he had long avoided. It was about something much bigger. It was about preserving the stories of his brothers in arms, those who had fought and fallen, and the legacy they had left behind. One afternoon, as Miller sat in the small living room of his modest home, a knock on the door broke the silence. He opened it to find an older man, his uniform pressed and immaculate, standing on his doorstep. The man's face was unfamiliar, but the uniform, the dark blue of a Navy captain, spoke volumes. "Mr. Miller?" the captain asked, his voice respectful but not without a touch of awe. Miller nodded. "That's me," he replied, stepping aside to let the captain in. The captain entered and looked around, taking in the modest surroundings with an unspoken respect. "I've heard your story, sir," the captain began, his eyes meeting Miller's with a mix of admiration and something deeper. "It's an honor to meet you." Miller smiled softly, his expression unchanged. "It's just a house," he said, gesturing to the room. "But the honor's all mine, Captain. What brings you here?" The captain paused for a moment, as if weighing his words. "I wanted to speak with you about something," he said slowly. "There's a new initiative in the Navy to honor our veterans in a way that's never been done before. We're working on creating a Veterans Memorial, something that truly represents the sacrifices that so many of you have made." Miller's heart skipped a beat. He had heard rumors of such initiatives, but never thought it would come to his door. "And you want me to be a part of that?" he asked. The captain nodded. "Yes, sir. We want to tell your story, the real story, the one that's been hidden for too long. And we want to honor the men you fought alongside, the ones who never made it back." Miller sat down, his mind racing. He thought of the men he had lost, the ones whose faces were still fresh in his memory despite the years that had passed. He thought of the battles, the quiet moments in between the chaos, when they would share a drink or a laugh, knowing that tomorrow was never guaranteed. And he thought of the promise he had made to them, that their stories would not be forgotten. "I don't know," Miller said quietly, looking down at the floor. "I never wanted this. I never wanted the spotlight." The captain sat down across from him, his gaze understanding. "I know, sir," he said gently. "But sometimes, the spotlight isn't for us. It's for the ones who never got to tell their story. It's for the ones who are still out there, waiting for someone to remember them. You don't have to do this for you, but you can do it for them." Miller took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision press on his chest. For so long, he had kept his past hidden, buried deep inside. But now, the time had come to share it. Not for fame, not for glory, but for the men who had given everything and never asked for anything in return. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll do it. But only because they deserve to be remembered." The captain smiled, his face lighting up with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. You don't know how much this means." Over the next few weeks, Miller's life began to shift in ways he hadn't expected. He sat for interviews, spoke to reporters, and shared his story with anyone who would listen. Each retelling of his past brought with it a flood of emotions: pride, sorrow, regret. But through it all, he kept his focus on the men he had served with, the ones who had been lost. He spoke of them, not as a hero, but as a brother. As the news spread, the impact of his words was felt far beyond the confines of his small town. The memorial project gained momentum, and soon, it was no longer just an idea. It was a reality. The Navy, alongside several veteran organizations, began to work on a memorial that would serve as a lasting tribute to the sacrifices of veterans like Miller. And when it was finally unveiled, Miller stood at the front, flanked by other veterans, his heart full of both pride and humility. The names of those he had fought with were etched into the stone, a testament to their courage, their sacrifices, and their legacy. As the crowd gathered around the memorial, Miller took a moment to step back and look at the faces of the men and women who had come to honor him. He saw tears in their eyes, not for him, but for the fallen. He realized then that this was not just about him. It was about every veteran who had ever served, every soldier who had ever fought for something greater than themselves. It was about ensuring that their stories would never be forgotten, that their sacrifices would be remembered. And as the sun set behind the memorial, casting a golden light over the engraved names, Miller finally understood. The legacy he had fought for, the one that had been buried for so long, was no longer just his. It belonged to all of them. The dedication ceremony for the memorial had been scheduled for months, but it was clear from the beginning that it would be more than just a formality. The day arrived, crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant shade of blue as hundreds of veterans, families, and military personnel gathered in the heart of the city. Among them was John Miller, standing near the front with his head held high, surrounded by men and women who had also served their country. For the first time in his life, Miller felt as though he wasn't alone. The crowd buzzed with anticipation as the time drew near. The memorial, a towering granite monument etched with the names of countless veterans who had never received the recognition they deserved, stood proudly in the center of the park. It was not just a tribute to Miller, but to all those who had fought and fallen, those who had given their all and been forgotten by the world. As the ceremony began, the Admiral stepped forward, his uniform pristine and his face solemn. He addressed the crowd with the kind of authority that only years of service could give, his voice steady and filled with respect. Today, we honor not just the sacrifices of those who are no longer with us, but the legacy they left behind, he began. This memorial stands as a symbol of their bravery, their commitment, and the unbreakable bond that connects all of us who have served. And it is a reminder that we will never forget. As the Admiral spoke, Miller's thoughts drifted back to the countless moments of sacrifice he had witnessed. He thought of the men he had served with, the ones who had never made it back, and the ones who had left the battlefield forever changed. But today was not about the pain of loss. It was about celebrating the courage and honor that had defined their lives. After the Admiral's words, the crowd stood in silence. The sound of a lone trumpet echoed through the park as a bugler played a soft, mournful melody. Miller closed his eyes, allowing the music to wash over him. It was a sound that spoke to the heart of every veteran in attendance, a sound that carried with it the weight of all the years spent in service. When the music faded, Miller stepped forward, his gait steady but slow. He approached the memorial with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through every challenge in his life. As he reached the stone, he placed his hand gently on its surface, feeling the coolness of the granite beneath his fingers. He didn't speak at first, but the silence that hung between him and the crowd was profound. It was as if the very air had thickened with the weight of the moment. And then, with a voice steady and clear, Miller spoke. "This is not just a monument to the men we've lost," he said, his words carrying across the quiet park. "It is a monument to all of us, the ones who came home, the ones who fought on, and the ones who carried the weight of those who didn't make it back." His voice faltered for just a moment, but he steadied himself, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "We don't do this for glory. We do it because it's the right thing to do. We do it because we owe it to those who gave everything, to those who never had the chance to say goodbye, to those who fought, who bled, who died, and who will never be forgotten." There was a long pause as Miller stepped back, allowing the crowd to absorb his words. And then, as the crowd began to break into applause, something remarkable happened. One by one, veterans from all branches of the military stood, each of them saluting the monument with a quiet reverence. The applause grew louder, but it was not the sound of a crowd celebrating a hero. It was the sound of a nation coming together to honor the true meaning of sacrifice. As the ceremony continued, Miller felt a sense of peace that he had never experienced before. He wasn't the only one being honored today. This was a collective tribute to every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who had ever served, who had ever fought for something greater than themselves. And as the last of the ceremonies concluded, Miller took a moment to look around at the sea of faces, some old, some young, but all of them sharing in the same experience. This was his legacy. This was their legacy. And for the first time in a long while, Miller felt a sense of closure. The years of service, the battles fought, the pain of loss, it had all led him here, to this moment, where the world had finally acknowledged the true meaning of sacrifice. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, Miller remained standing by the memorial, his hand still resting on the stone. He thought of his brothers in arms, the ones who had not made it home, and he knew that they were there with him in spirit. The world may have forgotten them, but today, their memory would live on in a way that could never be erased. Months passed after the dedication ceremony, and life for John Miller slowly began to settle back into a rhythm. The world had witnessed his story, and though the recognition had been monumental, it had not changed who he was. He was still the same man who had fought through battles, survived the unimaginable, and stood tall when everyone else faltered. But something had shifted inside him. The weight of his past, which had always felt like a burden, now seemed like a mantle. The stories of his brothers in arms, the ones who never made it back, were being heard by the world. And for once, Miller felt as though they were being honored in the way they deserved. One evening, as Miller sat in his quiet home, reflecting on the past, the phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was familiar. It was the Admiral. "John," the Admiral began, his voice steady and serious. "I need you to come to Washington. There's something important we need to discuss." Miller, taken aback, asked, "What's going on?" The Admiral paused for a moment before replying. "It's about the future of the Veterans Memorial Project. There's a new initiative, and I want you to be involved. This could change everything for veterans across the country." Without hesitation, Miller agreed to the meeting, feeling a sense of purpose stir within him. The next day, he boarded a plane bound for Washington, D.C. As he walked through the airport, he noticed how much had changed in the world since his days of active service. People hurried past, heads down, caught in their own lives. But as he moved through the crowds, it struck him that the world was still moving forward, without forgetting the sacrifices made by people like him. At the Pentagon, Miller was escorted through the halls, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had no idea what awaited him, but he knew one thing for certain. The legacy of his brothers in arms was far from over. As he entered the meeting room, he saw the Admiral standing by the window, looking out over the city. The Admiral turned as Miller approached, offering a nod of recognition. "John," he said, "thank you for coming. We have a lot to discuss." The room was filled with senior military officers and veteran advocates, all gathered to discuss the next phase of the Memorial Initiative. It was clear that something big was about to unfold. This initiative, the Admiral began, is about more than just a memorial. It's about creating a permanent legacy for veterans, ensuring that their stories, their sacrifices, and their service are never forgotten. We want to make sure that future generations understand what it means to serve. Miller listened intently as the Admiral continued to outline the plans. The memorial would expand into a national network, a place where veterans' stories could be shared and celebrated across the country. It would be more than just a physical monument. It would be a living tribute to the men and women who had served in every branch of the military. "John," the Admiral said, turning toward him, "we want you to be the face of this project. Your story, your leadership, and your dedication to honoring the fallen make you the perfect person to lead this initiative." Miller's heart skipped a beat. He had never sought out the spotlight, but now, it seemed like the world was asking him to step forward in a way he had never imagined. He looked around the room at the faces of the men and women who had dedicated their lives to serving the country, and he knew that he could not refuse. "I'm honored," Miller said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us, the veterans who have given everything, the ones who are still fighting, and the ones who never made it home. We have to make sure their stories live on." The Admiral nodded, his expression filled with pride. "That's exactly why we need you, John. You understand what it means to carry that legacy forward." For the next few hours, the team discussed the plans in greater detail. The memorial project would expand its reach, creating a nationwide effort to ensure that veterans were honored not just for their service, but for the lives they had touched and the sacrifices they had made. The initiative would include educational programs, veteran outreach efforts, and a platform for telling personal stories of heroism and courage. As the meeting came to a close, Miller left the room with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but he knew that this was the path he was meant to follow. The stories of the fallen had been told, but now it was time to make sure those stories would never be forgotten. As he stood outside the Pentagon, looking out over the city, Miller realized that the world had changed for him. He was no longer just a man who had served. He was now a living bridge between the past and the future, a keeper of the stories that needed to be told. And as he made his way back home, he knew that this new chapter in his life was just the beginning. The days following the meeting in Washington were filled with planning and action. Miller had agreed to be the face of the Veterans Memorial Initiative, a role that now consumed much of his time. As the project gained momentum, the impact of his decision began to ripple through his life. Veterans organizations, local communities, and schools began to reach out, eager to partner with Miller on the initiative. The public's response was overwhelmingly positive, but the pressure to ensure the project's success weighed heavily on him. There were long meetings, countless phone calls, and constant coordination with other veterans who shared his vision of honoring the fallen. But through it all, Miller's commitment never wavered. As the project took shape, the memorial became something more than just a physical structure. It became a living tribute to the sacrifices made by veterans from all wars. The national network that Miller had envisioned was slowly becoming a reality. Memorials were being established in major cities across the country, each one designed to reflect the unique experiences of the veterans in that region. Interactive exhibits were being created to tell the stories of individual soldiers, allowing future generations to learn about the courage, sacrifice, and valor of those who served. Miller found himself traveling from city to city, overseeing the progress of the memorials, meeting with veterans, and sharing his own story. It was exhausting work, but he took it all in stride. He knew that what he was doing was important, vital, even. Each city he visited, he saw firsthand the impact the memorials were having. Veterans were sharing their stories, families were learning about their loved ones' sacrifices, and young people were gaining a deeper understanding of the cost of freedom. In one city, he met a man named Tom, a Vietnam War veteran who had lost both legs in an ambush. Tom had never spoken about his experiences before, but the memorial gave him the opportunity to share his story. For the first time, he found himself surrounded by others who understood the weight of what he had endured. As Tom spoke, Miller listened intently, his heart heavy with the recognition that so many veterans had never received the recognition they deserved. "This," Tom said, his voice breaking, "this is the first time I've felt like I belong. Like my service actually mattered." Miller nodded, his own emotions rising to the surface. "You matter," he said quietly. "All of you matter." It was moments like these that reminded him why he had taken on this responsibility. It wasn't about the accolades, the press, or the recognition. It was about making sure that every veteran, every soldier who had ever served, was honored. It was about ensuring that their stories lived on long after they were gone. But even as the memorial initiative continued to grow, Miller felt the weight of the years. He was no longer the young man who had fought in the jungles of Vietnam, nor was he the officer who had risen to prominence. He was an old man now, and the toll of his life in service had begun to show. His back ached, his joints were stiff, and his breath came more slowly than it used to. Yet, as he looked around at the memorials, at the faces of the veterans who had shared their stories with him, he knew that every moment of pain, every hour of hard work, was worth it. The legacy he had built would outlive him, and that was the greatest honor he could ever ask for. One evening, as he sat alone in his small apartment, looking over some of the plans for an upcoming memorial in New York City, he received a letter. It was from a young woman, a daughter of one of the veterans who had passed away before his story could be shared. In her letter, she thanked him for his work and explained how the memorial had given her a sense of closure. She spoke of how her father had never spoken about the war, how he had always carried the weight of his experiences alone, but seeing his name etched in stone had helped her understand him in a way she never had before. Miller's eyes welled up with tears as he read her words. This was the purpose of his work, the reason he had fought so hard for this project, to ensure that no veteran, no matter how isolated or forgotten they felt, was ever truly alone. That night, as he closed the letter and placed it gently on his desk, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do. The stories of the fallen were being heard, and the legacy of his brothers in arms would live on. The next day, Miller returned to the memorial in Washington, standing before it with a quiet reverence. He ran his fingers over the names etched in the stone, each one a life lost, a memory preserved. As the sun set behind him, casting long shadows across the park, Miller knew that this was where he was meant to be. This was his purpose, to ensure that the stories of those who had given everything for their country would never be forgotten. And as he stood there, surrounded by the silence of the memorial, he knew that his work was far from over. The fight to honor the fallen would continue, and he would be there to see it through to the end. As the weeks went by, the success of the Veterans Memorial Initiative continued to grow. Miller, though now somewhat weary from the constant traveling and endless meetings, found a renewed sense of purpose in each city he visited. The memorials that were popping up across the country were more than just monuments. They were places of healing, of connection, and most importantly, of remembrance. The stories of countless veterans, those who had fought and sacrificed for their country, were being preserved and shared in ways they had never been before. Every unveiling was a new chapter in the journey Miller had started. One afternoon, as Miller sat in his quiet home, reflecting on the work still ahead of him, the phone rang once again. This time, it was the Admiral. "John," the Admiral said, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to talk. There's an important development I want to bring to your attention." Miller listened intently as the Admiral explained the new project. It was an initiative that would focus on providing support for veterans who were struggling to adjust to civilian life. The project would not only honor their service, but offer them tangible assistance, job training, mental health services, and financial aid. It was a monumental undertaking, one that Miller knew could change the lives of thousands of veterans who had fallen through the cracks. "This project," the Admiral continued, "will build on the memorials we've established. It will give veterans the resources they need to thrive after they return home, instead of just being forgotten." Miller could feel the weight of the conversation. He had seen firsthand how difficult it was for many veterans to reintegrate into society after their service. The scars of war were not always visible, and many found themselves isolated, struggling to find purpose. This new project, the Admiral explained, would focus on giving veterans the tools to rebuild their lives, just as the memorials were giving them the recognition they deserved. Miller agreed to take part in the initiative, knowing that it would be another crucial step in ensuring that the sacrifices of veterans were never overlooked. The next few months were a blur of meetings, fundraising events, and speeches. The new project took shape quickly, with veterans organizations, mental health experts, and business leaders coming together to offer their support. Miller traveled to several cities to help launch the program, meeting with veterans from all walks of life. In one city, he sat down with a former soldier named Jason, who had struggled with PTSD since returning home from deployment. Jason had found it difficult to keep a job, and his relationships had suffered. "I don't know where to go from here," Jason said, his voice trembling as he spoke. Miller looked at him with understanding. "I know it feels impossible sometimes," Miller said softly, "but you're not alone. There are people out there who want to help, who want to make sure you don't have to do this on your own." Jason nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I just don't want to be forgotten," he whispered. Miller placed a hand on his shoulder. "You won't be. I promise you that." As the project gained momentum, the stories of veterans like Jason began to change. The support they received was not just emotional. It was practical, with real-world solutions being offered to help them rebuild their lives. Miller saw firsthand the power of giving veterans the opportunity to succeed after they left the battlefield. It was a long road, but the progress was undeniable. In one particularly moving moment, Miller attended the opening of a new veterans support center in a small town. As he stood before the crowd of veterans, their families, and local supporters, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. These men and women had served their country, and now they were getting the help they needed to thrive. "This is what it's all about," Miller said, his voice full of emotion. "It's not enough to honor our veterans after they've passed. We need to make sure they have the resources they need to live fulfilling lives, to keep fighting for the future they deserve." The crowd erupted in applause, and for a moment, Miller allowed himself to take it all in. It had been a long, difficult journey, but it was all worth it. The stories of the veterans he had served with, and the ones who had never come home, would live on. And now, their legacies would be seen not just in stone, but in the tangible, life-changing support that they were receiving. As the day drew to a close, Miller found himself standing alone in front of the memorial in the town square. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the names etched into the stone. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let the silence wash over him. The world had changed, and in a way, so had he. The fight was not over, but the battle to honor his brothers in arms, to make sure their stories were heard, was now a fight that had been taken up by so many others. He felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years, knowing that the legacy of those who served would be carried forward. The work he had started was still in its early stages, but the path ahead was clear. The veterans were no longer forgotten. They had been given their place in history, and they had been given the chance to live a life of dignity and respect. As the months passed, the Veterans Support Initiative continued to grow, and John Miller found himself at the heart of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. The program that had once started as a simple idea to give back to the men and women who had given everything for their country had transformed into a national movement. Veterans across the country were finding new hope, new opportunities, and a new sense of belonging. The success of the memorials and the support centers had far exceeded expectations. From the small towns to the bustling cities, the program's reach had extended to every corner of the United States. Miller traveled from place to place, meeting veterans, hearing their stories, and witnessing firsthand the change he had helped create. Yet, despite the overwhelming success, there were moments when Miller felt a deep sense of exhaustion. It was not the physical fatigue from travel or the constant meetings. It was the emotional toll of carrying the stories of so many veterans, each one unique, each one heavy with its own burden. But there were still those moments, those fleeting moments when the gratitude of others reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. One of those moments came during a visit to a new veterans housing facility in Texas. Miller had been there to speak at the opening, but what struck him was the warmth of the reception. The veterans who lived there welcomed him like a long-lost friend, their faces lighting up when they saw him. Mr. Miller, a woman named Ruth, a Vietnam War veteran, said, her eyes misting over, "You've given us a place to call home again. I can't even tell you what that means." Miller smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's not me, Ruth. It's all of you. You're the ones who made this happen." But Ruth shook her head, her voice firm. "No, John. You're the one who gave us a voice. You're the one who made sure we weren't forgotten." Her words resonated with him long after he left Texas. He had heard it countless times, veterans thanking him, expressing their gratitude, but it never lost its impact. It was never about the praise or the recognition. It was about the ripple effect he had started. The change that was sweeping across the country was bigger than any one person. It was the collective effort of an entire nation coming together to honor its veterans. After returning from Texas, Miller was faced with a new challenge. The program had grown so large that it needed more resources, more funding, and more people to keep it running. While the memorials had been established, the Veterans Support Centers had become the heart of the initiative, providing job training, mental health services, and housing for those in need. But there were still many veterans out there, scattered across the country, who had not yet been reached. The Admiral, who had become Miller's closest ally in this effort, called him one day with a proposition. "John," the Admiral began, his tone serious, "we've been offered a significant grant from a private foundation. They want to help expand the initiative, but they're asking for one thing in return." Miller listened intently. "What's that?" "They want you to lead a national tour," the Admiral explained. "We want to take the story of the Veterans Support Initiative directly to the people. We'll bring the veterans together, hear their stories, and show the country just how important this initiative is. It's an opportunity to bring even more support and resources to those who need it." Miller hesitated. He wasn't sure he had the energy for another tour, another round of speeches and presentations. But he knew that if this was the path that would help more veterans, he had no choice but to say yes. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it." The national tour began shortly after that conversation, and Miller traveled from coast to coast, visiting cities big and small. At each stop, he met with veterans and their families, listening to their stories, sharing his own, and witnessing firsthand the struggles and triumphs of those who had served. The tour was grueling. Endless hours on the road, back-to-back events, and the constant pressure to perform. But through it all, Miller kept his focus on the mission. He kept reminding himself of the faces of the veterans he had met, the ones who had thanked him for giving them a voice. He kept pushing forward, knowing that the work was not yet done. In one particular city, as Miller spoke to a group of veterans, something unexpected happened. A young man, barely 20, stood up in the crowd. "I never thought I'd hear someone like you speak," the man said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've been back for 2 years, and I've felt invisible. I've felt like I don't belong, like nobody cares about what we went through." Miller looked directly at the man, sensing the weight of his words. "I understand," Miller said quietly, his voice carrying across the room. "But you are not invisible. Your story matters. Your sacrifice matters. and we're going to make sure the world knows it." The room fell silent for a moment, and then the crowd erupted into applause. It was moments like that, fleeting but powerful, that made all the sacrifices, all the hard work, worth it. The tour continued, but Miller knew that this wasn't the end. The initiative would go on, growing stronger with each passing day, each new story, each new veteran who found the help they so desperately needed. And as Miller stood on stage in front of another group of veterans, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was his mission. This was his purpose. The veterans would never be forgotten, and he would make sure of it. As Miller's national tour continued, the momentum behind the Veterans Initiative reached new heights. Each stop brought more recognition, more support, and more veterans who felt empowered by the message he was spreading. The program was no longer just an idea, it was a movement. The veterans were no longer invisible. Their stories were being heard, their struggles acknowledged, and their sacrifices honored in ways they had never been before. But for Miller, it wasn't just about the success of the initiative. It was about the personal connections, the conversations, the moments that couldn't be captured in press releases or news articles. It was the veterans he met. Along the way, each one carrying their own story, each one sharing a piece of themselves with him. One evening, after a particularly long day in a small town in Alabama, Miller found himself sitting with a group of veterans in a local diner. The clink of silverware and the murmur of conversation filled the air, but there was an undeniable sense of camaraderie among the group. Miller had gotten used to these quiet moments, these times when he could sit with the men and women who had served and listen without the pressure of speeches or media attention. A man named Greg, a Marine who had served in the Gulf War, spoke up. "You know, John, I never thought I'd be here," Greg said, his voice low but steady. "I thought my time was over. I thought I was done. But seeing what you've done, what this initiative is doing, it's like I'm seeing a light again." Miller smiled, the weight of Greg's words hitting him deeply. "That's exactly why we're here," Miller replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "None of you are done. Not as long as we're here to support each other." It was moments like this that gave Miller the strength to continue. The tour was exhausting, and there were days when the toll of it all seemed too much to bear. But when he saw the faces of veterans like Greg, he knew that every hour of hard work, every mile traveled, was worth it. As the tour progressed, Miller began to notice a change in the way veterans were interacting with the initiative. It wasn't just about the services provided. It was about the pride they felt in being seen, in being acknowledged. They no longer felt like the forgotten generation. They had been given a voice, and they were using it. The young recruits who had once been so skeptical, so dismissive, were now coming forward to offer their support. At one stop in Chicago, a group of young soldiers approached Miller after one of his speeches. "We're with you, sir," one of them said, his voice firm. "We'll help however we can. You've shown us what it means to honor our veterans, and we want to be part of that." Miller, taken aback by their sincerity, smiled. "Thank you," he said simply. "It's going to take all of us." But even with all the success, there was still a lingering feeling in the back of Miller's mind. As much as he had accomplished, there were still so many veterans who hadn't been reached, so many who were still struggling in silence. The work was far from over. One evening, after a particularly draining day in New York City, Miller found himself alone in his hotel room, staring out at the skyline. He thought about the veterans he had met, the ones who had thanked him for giving them a voice, and the ones who still had so much to say. He thought about his own brothers in arms, the ones who had never come home, and the promise he had made to them so many years ago, to make sure their stories lived on. It was then that the phone rang. It was the Admiral again. "John, we need you in Washington. It's time to take the next step," the Admiral said, his voice urgent. "What's going on?" Miller asked, sitting up straighter. "There's been a major development. We've just secured a partnership with a national television network," the Admiral explained. "They want to do a special series, focusing on the Veterans Initiative. It's a huge opportunity to reach millions of people. We need your leadership." Miller's heart raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the message would reach the masses, when the stories of veterans would be shared with an even broader audience. "When do we start?" he asked, already preparing for the next phase of the journey. The Admiral's voice softened. "We start now. We're not just telling stories, John. We're changing lives." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. The television series would follow Miller and the veterans as they visited memorials, attended support centers, and spoke with young soldiers. It was designed to humanize the veterans, to show the world that they were more than just statistics or headlines. They were real people with real stories, and they deserved to be seen. Miller knew this was going to be the most challenging part of the journey. It wasn't just about telling stories. It was about putting real faces to the sacrifices that had been made. It was about showing the world what it truly meant to serve. As the cameras rolled and the crew set up for the first shoot, Miller felt a sense of nervous anticipation. This was it. The message was about to reach a new, wider audience. And as he looked out at the veterans who had gathered for the filming, he knew that this moment, this series, would ensure that their stories would live on forever. The world would never forget them again. As the television series began, Miller felt the weight of the camera's gaze on him in a way he had never experienced before. He had spent so many years avoiding the spotlight, working behind the scenes to honor his brothers in arms. Now, his story, along with the stories of so many others, was being broadcast across the country. The crew had followed Miller as he visited veterans' homes, spoke at memorials, and sat down with families of the fallen. Each episode was a window into the lives of veterans who had fought for their country, their struggles, their victories, and their quiet moments of pride. As the series aired, it was clear that the world was listening. Viewership numbers soared, and social media exploded with support. Veterans, young and old, reached out to share their own stories, and families of soldiers who had never received recognition began to speak out. The series had sparked something far bigger than Miller could have imagined. It was a movement, one that extended beyond the television screen, one that was changing the way people thought about service and sacrifice. Yet, as Miller sat in the control room during the final editing sessions, he could feel a shift within himself. The work had always been about the veterans, about honoring their stories, ensuring that their voices were heard. But now, with the series reaching millions, he realized that this wasn't just about remembrance. It was about redemption. For so many veterans, the acknowledgement they had longed for was finally coming to them. They had lived in silence for so many years, their experiences hidden, their sacrifices forgotten. Now, they were being seen, and their worth was being recognized. Miller thought of the veterans he had met along the way, especially those he had met during the national tour. He thought of Greg from Alabama, Ruth from the Vietnam War, and Jason from the Gulf War. They had all found healing in different ways, but there was one thing they all shared: a desire to be seen and to have their stories told. During one particularly emotional shoot in New Orleans, Miller sat down with a group of veterans from the Korean War. The men were older, their faces lined with the years, but their memories were still sharp. They shared stories of bravery, of loss, and of a war that many had tried to forget. "We never got the thanks we deserved," one of the veterans, named Harry, said. "We came home to nothing. No parades, no recognition. Just silence." Miller listened carefully, feeling the weight of the words. He had heard this story before, from veterans of all wars, but it never lost its sting. "You're getting that recognition now," Miller said quietly. "The world sees you now. You'll never be forgotten again." Harry's eyes welled up, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the depth of his sacrifice. "It feels good to be remembered," he whispered. The cameras continued to roll, but in that moment, it was clear that this was the heart of the project. It was not about the fame or the accolades. It was about the veterans, their stories, and the acknowledgement they had been denied for so long. The final episode of the series was set to air in just a few weeks, and Miller knew that this would be the culmination of everything he had worked for. But as he watched the final cut, he realized that this was not an end, it was a beginning. The movement had taken on a life of its own, and it would continue to grow long after the series had ended. He thought of the younger veterans who had come forward, those who had once felt invisible but were now finding their voices. The world was no longer indifferent to their sacrifices. They had been given a platform, and their stories were being shared with future generations. When the final episode aired, it was more than just a documentary. It was a call to action. Veterans across the country, inspired by the series, began to share their stories and connect with one another. The initiative expanded beyond memorials and support centers. It became a nationwide movement to ensure that no veteran was ever left behind. Miller stood before the crowd one last time, his heart full of pride. The series had done its job. It had opened the eyes of a nation. But there was still more work to be done. The fight to ensure that every veteran was cared for, honored, and remembered was ongoing. And as Miller looked out at the faces of the veterans who had gathered to watch the final episode, he knew that this was just the beginning. The legacy of those who had served would never be forgotten. And he would be there, alongside them, making sure that their stories lived on. As Miller sat in the quiet aftermath of the final episode airing, he allowed himself a moment to reflect on the journey. It had been a long and arduous path, but it was also one that had given him a sense of purpose that he had not known in years. The movement he had started had changed the landscape of how veterans were perceived and supported. No longer were they relegated to the shadows of history, their sacrifices and struggles overlooked. They were being seen, heard, and most importantly, remembered. The success of the television series had given the initiative an unprecedented level of exposure. Millions of people across the country had watched, learned, and empathized with the veterans' stories. The impact had been immense. Support had poured in from all corners, financial contributions, volunteer efforts, and even government agencies beginning to take a deeper interest in the needs of veterans. Yet, despite all the progress, Miller knew the work was not done. There would always be more to do, more stories to tell, and more veterans to reach. It was a never-ending task, but one that Miller had fully embraced. As he stood in front of the newly opened Veterans Center in Los Angeles, he felt the weight of the past and the future pressing against him. The building was filled with veterans, their families, and members of the community, all gathered to celebrate the opening of yet another space that would offer support, care, and understanding. This was a place where veterans could come together, share their stories, and find the help they needed to navigate life after service. As Miller walked through the center, greeting old friends and new faces alike, he noticed something different. The atmosphere was no longer one of sorrow or struggle. It was a place of healing, of strength, and of pride. The veterans who walked through the doors no longer felt like outcasts. They were part of something much larger than themselves. They were part of a community that would never turn its back on them. The center's opening ceremony was filled with speeches, music, and laughter. Veterans shared their experiences, some painful, others triumphant, but all of them were filled with the unspoken bond of shared service. Miller took the stage at the end of the ceremony, his heart full. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, some weathered by time and hardship, others young, eager to embrace the legacy that had been created for them. "This is for all of us," Miller said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "For the ones who came home, for the ones who never made it back, and for the generations of veterans yet to come. This is not just a building. This is a symbol of everything we've fought for. And it's just the beginning." The crowd erupted into applause, and Miller felt a sense of peace settle over him. The legacy he had worked so hard to build was not just about the past. It was about the future. The work he had started would continue long after he was gone. The generations of veterans that followed would have the support, the recognition, and the care that they deserved. As the ceremony concluded, Miller stood outside the building, watching as the sun set over the horizon. He thought of his brothers in arms, those who had fallen and those who had lived, and he knew that their stories would continue to be told. They would never be forgotten. Miller had fulfilled his promise to them. The veterans had their place in history, and now they had a place in society, a place of respect, honor, and pride. The fight to ensure that no veteran was ever left behind would continue, but Miller knew that it was no longer just his fight. It was a fight that belonged to everyone. And as he looked around at the growing network of support for veterans, he realized that this was his legacy, a movement that had united a nation in gratitude for the service and sacrifices of its military men and women. The world had been reminded of the true cost of freedom, and the veterans who had paid that price had finally been given the recognition they deserved. And in that quiet moment, as the evening light bathed the Veterans Center in a warm glow, Miller knew that his work was far from over. But for the first time in his life, he was at peace. The stories of the fallen would never be forgotten. The work he had started would continue, carried on by those who had stood by him along the way. And he had no doubt that the legacy of those who served would continue to inspire future generations to fight, to serve, and to honor the values that made the country strong. This emotional story takes you on an unforgettable journey of sacrifice, honor, and redemption. It follows the life of a Vietnam War veteran who, after years of being overlooked, finds himself at the center of a national movement to honor and support military veterans. Through a series of emotional moments and personal connections, this story showcases the challenges and triumphs of those who have served. From the opening of new memorials to the creation of veteran support centers, this emotional story is a testament to the resilience of those who have fought for freedom. Along the way, the protagonist not only confronts his past, but also discovers that the fight for veterans' recognition is far from over. His commitment to ensuring that every veteran is honored leads to an initiative that changes lives, offering hope and healing to those who have sacrificed so much. This emotional story highlights the importance of remembering those who served, and the impact of giving them the recognition they deserve. With every step of this journey, the emotional story deepens, reminding us all of the true cost of freedom and the value of service. This emotional story will leave you reflecting on the courage and dedication of the men and women who have given everything for their country.